Thank you for joining this IST Logistics for 712. We have our first presentation on Plant Nutrition Oversight Committee work and how the recommendations are developed and approved in IFAS. Our panel for this topic is Dr. Saqib Mukhtar, Dr. Rao, Lincoln Zotarelli, and Bob Hochmuth. I would start and introduce Dr. Mukhtar here to give us an overview of Plant Nutrition Oversight Committee.
Thank you very much, Lakesh. I appreciate it. So just to give you a very quick overview on before I start this presentation, I've been a part of this Plant Nutrient Oversight Committee, or PNOC, for about 5 years now. And I will just give you a little bit of what I have seen or understand about the committee and its makeup, and then I will let Dr. Rao explain how these recommendations come to being. So just I'll provide a few examples also, but to start out, I would just show you what is the makeup of this committee. So there are total 14 members of the PNOC, and there are 4 state faculty. There is 1 district extension director, and then there are 4 department chairs, and these departments are horticulture, both environmental and horticultural sciences. We have agronomy, and we have soil and water sciences represented there. Same thing with the state faculty, and then we have a representative from the Research and Education Center, one of the directors, and then there are 4 IFAS Research and Extension administrators. 3 of them are Dr. Place, myself, and Dr. Obriza, and we also have Dr. Rob Gilbert, who's the research dean. So that is the makeup of the PNOC. Ideally, what we want to look at when it comes to IFAS fertilizer recommendations is a couple of things. We want the fertilizer recommendations to do 2 things for us. One is that it should contain the recommended rate of fertilizer, and Raukan will explain that, what I mean by the rate of fertilizer. And then we must also make sure that that includes the management strategies for getting the most from the fertilizer investment while also protecting the environment. So those are the 2 main things that we should look at when it comes to developing those recommendations that are brought in front of the committee, and then committee reviews that and then approves it. During my presence of the last 5 years, we have had 1 recommendation for fertilizers, and that is for turf grass that was approved. And we also have had a couple of other examples where we did not have the data for Florida, so that there was no recommendation but guidelines. So I'm going to give you the examples of what is out there in terms of IFAS recommendations versus IFAS guidelines. So as you all know, this EDIS publication has been around for quite some time. This was put together by George Hochmuth and Ed Hanlon. This is primarily talking about the summary of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium research with tomato in Florida. This is a work that they had conducted over the research that was done for 60 years within the state of Florida in different regions, different varieties. And as a result of that work, they were able to come up these recommendations for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and micronutrients. They also considered all the management practices, for example, whether it's going to be micro-irrigated or it will be overhead irrigation. And they also looked at the type of fertilizers that was being used. So in other words, primarily, what they did was they took this data from various types of researches that were done within the state of Florida in different areas under different types of conditions and management conditions and irrigation, for example, and they started looking at what are some of the recommendations that they can compile for the state of Florida. So in case of tomato, This is what they did. This is their data summary method. They looked at the evaluated tomato yield responses to different rates of applied fertilizer that required a standardized method of summarizing statewide. So for example, there may be somebody reporting it as pounds of nitrogen per acre, somebody reported yield in terms of boxes, somebody reported yield in terms of pounds. And so they had to come up with a method to standardize how they could summarize the yields. And then the yields varied with, of course, as I mentioned, seasons, cultivar, and location in the state. And then they had to calculate a relative yield, and they calculated as percentage, and that was chosen as the unit to express tomato yield response to fertilization. And then relative yield in their methodology is an accepted scientific method for summarizing and presenting data across statewide sources and reports. And then you can see that originally this publication was published in 2000. It was again revised in 2011, and then there were not any major revisions after 2011. So it was reviewed once again and republished. In other words, as you know, all EDIS publications go through this sunset procedure, and if there is no review done, there is no revision done, and there's no one there to write the EDIS publication or own an EDIS publication, they go into the sunset. Otherwise, they're revised or they're reviewed and they're brought back up with a new date. So for example, in this very large study that they had looked at, they came up with these two statements for nitrogen. In other words, they said that in these studies, most tomato crops responded to applied fertilizer nitrogen up to 200 pounds per acre. And then they also mentioned that if there is a soil that is, tomatoes are grown on loamy soils compared to sandy soils, then you will need slightly less nitrogen. I did not see a specific number that they gave, but it said slightly less than 200 pounds per acre. Here's another example of one of the recommendations. So this is, I'm going to skip this slide. It's in instances where we do not have data for state of Florida, where we do not have research trials, where we do not have published data by our peers in a reputable journal, we do not provide IFAS recommendations. Instead, we provide the information that we have in terms of fertilization from other states, or maybe if a certain crop is similar to some other crops where we have some recommendations. So that's what we call guidance. So the most recent example, for example, here is from the information that we have provided on fertilizing for hemp. You can see some of the authors here. Dr. Rao is part of that group. So what they did, they looked at what's available in terms of literature out there, which is the closest to what we can see in this type of crop. And then they provided the guidelines. And this was published just this year. And again, this is not a recommendation. These are just guidelines. We did the similar thing with our, in the past, we've done similar things with other crops. For example, when it comes to olives. About 3 years ago, we had, we were asked questions about, well, what do you recommend for fertilizing olive trees? Again, we did not have published data. We did not have a record of yield versus different rates of fertilizer in the state of Florida. So it was just, we gathered information from other states, what's available for fertilizer recommendations from other states, but we call them guidelines. So the message here is that when information comes to the PNOC or the oversight committee, plant nutrient oversight committee, the questions are, has this research been conducted in the state of Florida? has this research been published in a reputable journal and have the peers reviewed it? If that information is available, the committee looks at the evidence and committee votes on whether this will be adopted as a recommendation or whether we need some more work done. Until the more work is done, we have solid recommendations. This is still termed as a guidance and not a recommendation. With that, I think I will pass it on to Lakesh, you or Dr. Rao.
Thank you, Dr. Mukhtar. Dr. Rao, I think you have 9 minutes to finish up your presentation, so I would appreciate if you could briefly explain your experience with the nutrient recommendation in IFAS.
Sure. Hope you can hear me. I have a small presentation, but I can skip that and just speak to you directly. Just like Dr. Mukhtar has explained, I think when I came into this position as the director of the soil testing lab and a soil fertility specialist in the department 20 plus years ago, I was told our recommendations kind of existed in Florida, IFAS recommendations for nearly 80 years prior to that. So obviously now, adding another 20 plus years after that, we're close to 100 or more than 100 years of history in terms of fertilizer research, fertility research, and their recommendations and how they have grown over time. So these have been in existence for as long as we have the lab. The lab has been in the department and across IFAS operating for the past 61 or 62 years so far. So obviously all this information is gathered over this period. And the Plant Nutrient Oversight Committee itself was existing, from late 1980s. It just did not function effectively for just a few years because my predecessor, Ed Hanlon, kind of moved to a center to become the center director. So that's when the PNOC, the Plant Nutrient Oversight Committee, was not fully in session. But when I came, that was the first thing I did, because based on my previous experience from Clemson, I was there in Clemson doing very similar work. And there was a committee, statewide committee of the university, as well as some private entities in that case, and also some state agencies were part of that committee. And everybody kind of gathered around the table and discussed the research and possibilities of adjusting the fertilizer recommendations as needed. And that was, to a part, was something that evolved during the discussions. It may be not necessarily, whatever is research has to become practical at the field level and has to be applicable. So that's how it got translated and then got approved. So when I came here, I didn't see a Plant Nutrient Oversight Committee functioning, in the late 1998. So then I went immediately to Chris Waddell, who was our extension dean, kind of explained to her that the need for reconstituting this, and she has immediately agreed. And I took my department chair, Randy Brown, with me at that time for more support. And everyone agreed across the board that this is an extremely valuable group that has to kind of oversee what happens at the IFAS level and on behalf of IFAS statewide. So it was reconstituted. So I've been there since 22, 23 years so far as a part of this committee dealing with it. And then, like Dr. Mukhtar explained, there were a couple of 3 occasions where some recommendation changes were approved. But a lot of times it's the data that was always being needed. So anybody that wants to change can come up to this Plant Nutrient Oversight Committee. And right after that constitution of this PNOC about 20 years ago, I have written a fact sheet. It is fact sheet. It is up on our website. It is SL189. It is called, I think, I'm trying to remember the name. It's called, I have written several under nutrient management series in the early years. And this is called Standardized Nutrient Recommendation Development Process. and it is SL189. That's the number. And that has been there for 20 plus years, kind of explains how the recommendation process occurs and how anybody can effect changes, if that someone sees it appropriate or necessary. So this process is like any researchers or any group of researchers has to develop a set of data. They have to gather the data and then publish it in a refereed journal. That's the requirement. Without that, you cannot proceed too far. So it has to be peer reviewed, just like Dr. Mukhtar explained earlier. So only then it will be moving forward. And then we have had related aspects, in terms of recommendations that are like management. When do you apply? How do you apply? What form you apply? What is the source? What is the timing? Some of those also have come in front of the Plant Nutrient Committee, and they have also looked at it. In many cases, they have approved because they kind of become part of the BMPs. And one of the examples is that I have done, I was part of the very first BMP exercise in IFAS that we have done with FDACs. At that time, the director, Rich Budell, myself, and few other researchers in the department and specialists in other departments around IFAS, and a few people from FDACs, and in some cases, a couple of people from FDEP also joined. So we all have worked up what we now call BMPs for forage grasses, particularly the Bahia grass type of ranches. That's the largest acreage in the state, where we have developed BMPs for fertilization, the type of fertilization, the source of nitrogen recommendation. In this case, it's all about nitrogen recommendation. So we have done that, and that I have published as my first experience, in the state, in the Journal of Extension in, I think, 2002 or 2003. Once I understood the process and how it got evolved, and we had lots of meetings with the growers out in the counties, in the evening church meetings where FDACs came out, and then we all gathered together and together explained to the growers what these were, and then the extension agents in those counties were involved. So that was a very, very good exercise, particularly for me coming in new. I learned a lot during that time, with all these other people around. So what the thought process was and how we should make sure that whatever we have done is really a good research and science-based research and information available. So those are still available as of today. And then in that, at that time, anybody is involved, you may know, anybody supplying Bahia samples for Bahia ranches. And if they are looking for phosphorus recommendation, one of the requirements based on that BMP process that was adopted was that they have to apply a complementary plant tissue, soil, a grass tissue sample along with a soil sample. A soil sample alone will not be enough or adequate to develop to provide a phosphorus recommendation. That's because Bahia grass has deeper root systems, and then the soil samples are only in the top 6 inches of the profile. Therefore, these will be able to take up phosphorus from many other parts. So, simultaneously, the leaf tissue also has to show a phosphorus deficiency in case, a phosphorus recommendation is being, asked for. So therefore, that's one of the BMPs. So there is a particular set of tests that are done for that, a plant tissue and a simultaneous soil test. Both are combined, and based on the research, it was established that one, the soil has to be low or medium in phosphorus. Right alongside, complementary to that, should be a leaf tissue should have 0.15% of P2O5 or less. It has to have as a concentration, leaf concentration. Only then a phosphorus recommendation will be triggered. Otherwise, if you just send in a sample for Bahia, you'll just get all other recommendations except phosphorus. Similarly, there was a nitrogen source. And when we went to the farmers in North Florida particularly, and there is several in South Florida, we found out that they do apply anhydrous ammonium, which is pretty inefficient when you apply, because it volatilizes right away. The losses are pretty high. So the growers have requested an allowance for that. So therefore, what was about 100 pounds each time was also given an opportunity. Whenever they apply anhydrous, they can apply up to 120, which is a real concern for anyone that's applying anhydrous. It is a real reason, because there's a real loss of nitrogen right away. So therefore, but however, people opt for ammonium anhydrous because it's the cheapest and it has the highest amount of nitrogen in it, 82%. So that's one of the things. So this is how the BMPs got developed, started developing. And soon after, we had commodity after commodity that got together and then said, for green industries, for various other commodities, we have now several BMPs in place. Citrus was another major one that, we all were part of. And of course, those have to be continuously developed and improved as we do. But coming back to the soil test and how we develop recommendations, two things I want to put in front of you. Most of you know, but however, I want to re-emphasize for nitrogen. If somebody is looking for a nitrogen recommendation, let me explain that, emphasize that there is no soil test for nitrogen. This is true all over the world. Actually, if anyone is still doing, that's only they are trying to somehow get an idea. But however, there is no reliable. It's not that we do not know how to test, or not that we do not know, we do not have the equipment. We have the state of the art equipment. We know how to test everything pretty much as the sample comes in, just about everything. But however, the nitrogen amounts, concentrations change in the soil very quickly based on the weather, climate, and many other things. So by the time the sample comes up here, it's tested, and then the recommendation goes back. A lot of things would have changed in terms of mineralization. The form of nitrogen would have changed from one to another, from organic to inorganic, nitrate to nitrite to so etc. So that way there are losses. It starts dynamically moving. Therefore, to rely on a soil test will not be very smart in that case. So most of that all that recommendation comes from published research, and that has come through the Plant Nutrient Oversight Committee, and that has been approved. That's what we have. These are available in our publications. We have agronomic publications. We have.
Rao, sorry to interrupt you. We have one more minute for you.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So anyway, that's how it all goes. But however, there is a soil test for phosphorus. These are the two nutrients that we are very concerned about, nitrogen and phosphorus, because both of them have can potentially have some negative environmental impacts. That's where we have to be very careful. And one of the reasons why we, although there is a lot of demand and a lot of concern about the conservativeness of our recommendations, all we need at this point, we have tried many times all over, just I did myself, several people, but what it is the response to added phosphorus beyond IFAS recommendations is not always seen. You think you see every so often, but when you go back to again retest, you don't find it. So it's one of those touch and go types of situations. So unless a confirmed, consistent data is produced and then published and then brought to the Plant Nutrient Committee for approval, unfortunately, this cannot be changed, immediately. Therefore, one of the main things that has to happen is we all need to come together, put all our heads together, and then formulate a very decent, good study, down to earth study in various parts. Depends on how the funding goes, and then create an opportunity for all of us to discuss and conduct an experiment or a series of field studies, both in the farmers' fields and at the research stations, to see how we can help improve if there is any deficiencies at this point. But no one is stopping change. All we need is just a bunch of data that kind of supports and then conclusively shows the evidence that there is a requirement. And the agencies always, when you speak to the agencies, they say, is it legally defensible? Whatever changes we are making, are these legally defensible? That's where our publications and refereed journal articles do come handy. So we know we have the research in place and we can do all that. So that's where my thing. Any questions, I will be happy to answer. My email is raom@ufl.edu. Thank you.
We'll take the question after finishing up with Lincoln and Bob. Hi, Bob. Could you please explain your experience on carrot nitrogen recommendation that you are working on?
Yes, thanks for the opportunity. The initiation of the carrot work that we conducted here started as a result of carrot acreage in this area becoming a relatively new crop. It's new to this region, however, not necessarily new to Florida. Historically, there was significant acreage of carrot grown down on the muck soils, and up in this area, all of the new acreage that came here maybe 5 years ago, 4 years ago, is all on sands. So there was a significant push from just maybe a few hundred acres to somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 acres of carrots. The initiation of the acreage was a result of California, a result of the water situation in California, where a couple of the large producers out there had trouble with water. They had basically one of two choices, either to move somewhere else on the West Coast or to bite the bullet and move over to the East Coast, where they would be closer to the market. And so they decided to move east and establish the production here and expand upon what originally was being done in the Georgia-Florida border area around Lake Park with Coggins Farms. So the two players at that time that came, one was Grimway Farms, and the other one was actually Bill Gates, who was farming under his farming operation under the name of Generation Farms. Subsequently, that's all been combined into Grimway. So Grimway is the lone major player here at the current time. So along with coming from California, the fertilizer programs were sort of transitioned in terms of what they were doing in California, which seemed really high to me, that the rates that were normally used there were much higher than what it seemed like they should be for this area. There was interest on their part in both, and still is, both conventional and organic acreage. So to initiate this, I approached our partners in the Office of Ag Water Policy at FDACS to see if there would be a possibility of getting some funding to initiate some nitrogen work, which was successful. We were able to put together a 2-year project. And in the meantime, in developing this project, I was engaging heavily with the growers, so that I felt like ownership by the growers in the process was going to be really, really important. And so I was very diligent about doing that. They were very appreciative. In fact, they wanted to make sure that we had some of the equipment that we needed to mimic what they were doing. And one of the key pieces was a carrot seeding unit, which Generation Farms provided the funding for us to be able to get the seeding unit exactly the same type that they were using. So we initiated the work, 4 different carrot cultivars, 2 cut and peel types, and 2 cello types. So they're a little different use in the marketplace. The cello types are the larger ones that you would typically find in a cello bag. We were really, really fortunate, looking back on it, that we had 2 excellent growing condition winners for carrots when we did this work. And then the last 2 winners subsequent to that would have been a lot more treacherous, but the weather was great the 2 years that we did this. The data from those 2 years was very consistent, and we embarked on the data analysis interpretation part of it. Charles Barrett and myself. I don't consider myself a really expert statistician, but Charles is really good at that. And we solicited help from my retired brother, George, who has done a lot of the analysis of this kind of data over time. And just we'll kind of point out that some of this needs a unique look at it. The models that fit the data oftentimes are what's called a linear plateau, where you get increase up to a certain point and then it kind of levels off for an extended period or extended additional rates, but eventually might drop off. So our data fit the linear plateau model, and we have completed the journal article preparation. It's been reviewed internally with the university, and with just a couple of more modifications, Charles and I are ready to submit that to Hort Science. And so that's the step that we're taking to have what would be necessary to present this to PNOC. The current recommendation in Florida for carrots is 175 pounds per acre. And there was one study that George Hochmuth had done in Gainesville back in the early 90s. And that was the only sand land nitrogen research that's been done in Florida. And that was the basis for the 175 pound rate. We feel like there's a justification to increase that rate, or at least to request the increase of that rate from 175 to 200 pounds. But this is where I think it gets really difficult in terms of the assessment of these rates. In our trial, we use the 4R principles, the rate, and the placement, all of those aspects of it. And so that there was nothing broadcast in our trial. And the result was, we believed, to be close to 200 pounds per acre. The growers, however, would look at that and say, yeah, but that's not what we're doing. We're doing a lot more broadcasting. And so a rate for them, or the question for them would be, I can't get to 200 pounds without making cultural practice changes. So I feel like this focusing on a single number has really made things difficult. And in this particular study, I think the fact that we followed the 4Rs had as much impact as anything on what we finally came up with. So just in conclusion, I would say we're ready to submit the journal article. The key pieces to me along the way were that the growers were engaged every step of the way, from the formulation of the trials to supporting the trials, to coming to field days and actually seeing what was going on and being aware of us in the process of doing this research over that couple of years. So I'll sort of pause there and be happy at the end of the panel to take questions, but that's been the experience for our carrot research.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much. Lincoln, could you please explain in next 5 minutes about your nitrogen work that you have done in 10 years?
Perfectly. Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, back in 2010, the need for updating the recommendations, it was kind of revised by a vegetable fertilizer task force, and it's one of the IFAS publications. So where we made, I wasn't part of that. Daniel Cantliff was actually the lead, and they pretty much contrast what the IFAS recommendations were and what the industry, where the industry was in terms of nitrogen rates, and it was clear by that publication. The publication is online, and it's HS 1156, and that there is a gap, and that includes many. It's not only the rate, but actually how the fertilizer is applied. And so specifically for potatoes, we started in 2010 a series of trials in commercial fields. So we partner with 6 growers, and we actually hire one of the growers to do the application for us, and then we sat with them and kind of based on their management practices, which is different among the growers. So we established a series of trials, including um, the nitrogen rate and also the application timing. So which are the two main factors of that drive the nitrogen use efficiency by potatoes. And those trials were replicated, large plots, 150 feet plots at least, and and then IFAS, with the help from the research center in Hastings, so we were able to harvest plots, 20 feet plots and several plots several subplots per plot, and collect reliable statistical data that would allow us to perform the analysis of this. And that's one of the first challenges that we have. There has been many trials conducted, but to have a really reliable statistical power to be able to compare these treatments, it's really a key part of this. And I say that because the variability of weather and soils, and that plays that can really obscure some of the results. And we had to do this for about 5 years, to really be able to capture the variability of these fields and capture the variability of management. And so we were able to really pinpoint some of these differences, and contrasting, the yield levels. So the current recommendation is 200 pounds of nitrogen per hectare. And that was done for many years, over I would say back 50 years, and on average for those studies, yield were around 223 bags to the acre. And from the studies that we conduct in growers field, the average yield level is raised to about 346 350 bags to the acre. So we had an increase in yield over the years, and we, with the trials, we're able to establish a direct relationship with the nitrogen uptake. And by increasing yield, there isn't a higher requirement of nitrogen to sustain those yields. Complementary to this work done in growers field, we also did 15N isotopes. So we were able to trace where the nitrogen, the nitrogen from each application, what the timings of application were resulting in the highest efficiency, and we were able to determine between emergence and tuber initiation that efficiency would be up to 60%, which is really good compared to other crops. So we started working with the growers, establishing proper timing and rates. And what we're seeing now is, when we combine all this data, so the optimum the optimum rate can be raised to 224 pounds. And if we look at yields based on the requirement based on yield levels, so getting the range between 300 and 400 bags to the acre, so that would reflect on a requirement of nitrogen, including efficiency between 200 and 250 pounds of nitrogen. So when we put all this information together and we connect it with economic analysis, so we can establish exactly where is the investment going, investing in fertilizer and how that's going to return, and sharing that information with the growers so they can make the decisions, so they can basically look at, if they have fields that have potential for 300 plus bags, so they can establish a rate that that would result to that. And fields that probably with less productivity. So nitrogen is not a limiting factor. You know, there are other factors that might be limiting yield in that situation. You know, so investment in nitrogen fertilizer, for instance, is not going to return in yield. So that would be a decision that the grower would make, you know, to reduce their rate accordingly. So we proposed the last PNOC meeting. We proposed the rate based on 8 peer-reviewed publications that encompasses all this the study over the 5 years of field studies, and it was well accepted. That you know, I had positive feedback from the committee. And now we're in the process of establishing, you know, proper guidelines and writing an EDIS publication that would really break down, you know, the cases and how the recommendations, you know, to optimize efficiency, you know, and maximize yields in terms regarding to nitrogen. That's how this needs to be played by the growers, you know. So that's the process. That's where we're standing right now. Regarding to potatoes.
Thank you. Thank you. We have 2 more minutes to answer any questions if anybody may have. All right, so there might be a question at the end of the presentation. We will go with our second half of this IST, which is Chris Pettit and Mark Warren will present how agriculture agents could help growers to fulfill some of the SB 712 requirements. So Chris, would you like to present your thoughts?
Sure, Lakesh, and thanks. Good to see a lot of the same names, and the great Bob Hochmuth joining us, which is always good. I didn't have a presentation today. I've got, actually, you'll see my name on this list twice, but the Bonnie Wolf-Elias, who's our head of field staff, is also on with me. And it's really interesting because you know, it's actually a very fascinating segue, I think, from the great work that you guys are doing on, you know, some of these fertilizer rates. Because I was having a conversation with a couple folks, high ranking in your organization, about, you know, the kind of the history of where we're going. And I think what Bob just hit on is you know, a point that he made was very, very fascinating, in that, you know, you look at the history of application rates. You're in a very fascinating stance, because you started with you know, yield, and then you move to a second phase of economic yield, and then now we're on that phase where we're looking at you know, really sustainable yield, which goes to the, you know, our definition of best management practices, which is really the balance of production with the water resource protection, and the 4 R's really, you know, do come into play. And there's a very interesting you know, segue there, where, you know, our responsibility now, when you read statute, and we went through some of 712 yesterday, it's not just BMPs. It's not just, you know, implementation of. It is the applicable BMPs for a specific, you know, commodity production. And what's going on the landscape. It is the proper implementation of those, you know, of those BMPs, which leaves a lot for interpretation. But in terms of a governance overview, from our regulatory stance, it means that we have to take into consideration, yes, we need to take into consideration the way in which nutrients are being applied or irrigation is being applied, but we also and work to gain efficiencies within that structure. But we also have to look at whether that structure in and of itself is the applicable BMP, or whether we need to look at working with a producer to get to, instead of broadcast banding and being more precise. Because as we are seeing when we're balancing, when we're looking at the water quality side of the equation, and we see it over and over and over in these BMAPs. And again, Bob and Charles have been absolutely amazing in the research that they've done at Live Oak. You know, we continue to see, you know, in some cases status quo, in some cases negative water quality trends within these BMAPs. And, you know, it's on everybody to, you know, to continue to be as efficient as possible. So the very difficult task I think that we face in my office on a regulatory sense is, okay, what are those applicable BMPs when folks are saying in order to you know, be viable in a market, you know, we have to have, you know, we need to re-examine rates, or we need to be able to look at this, that, or the other thing. You know, we then are in a stance that we have to say, okay, we understand that, but how are you, you know, applying nutrients? How are you managing? What other BMPs are you putting in place on the property so as to deal with the back end of the problem, which is the water resource protection? And you know, even to that end, given that, you know, doesn't matter where you're at on climate change, but given that, as Rich Bedell, who was mentioned, used to say, you know, 90% of the impacts, you know, result from 10% of the precipitation events. That's all well and good, but last I checked, the wets are getting wetter, the dries are getting drier, and we're seeing greater incidences of these leaching events, which could mean more additional applications, and it could mean additional leaching into the water bodies and the water resources, which at that point means that the eye of the needle that we're trying to thread here continues to get, you know, tighter and tighter. And I'll use that to kind of go into, you know, the stance that we're now in with 712, which is continuing to find ways to communicate, to collaborate, to continue to coordinate between our agencies and also with the industry groups and the producers themselves, to be able to talk about what's going on the landscape and be able to talk through with education, with outreach, you know, how you can maintain yield by utilizing, you know, more efficient practices. How do we consider from a 10 to 40 acre, you know, producer to an 11,000 acre, you know, conglomerate producer? How do we consider who, what, and where, and how to get to those greatest efficiencies? How do we best use what are extremely limited cost share dollars that are taxpayer dollars that we are tasked with using as responsibly and efficiently as possible? And there continue to be ever, you know, burgeoning demands on those dollars at the same time for research, for demonstration, for cost share, for any number of different things. At the same time that those pots are shrinking. So I said to somebody the other day, I think, you know, at times we're trying to do a quadruple Lutz with both hands and both feet tied together. And the Russian it's all Russian judges, and they're all paying attention to something else. So, you know, the level of difficulty, particularly with the 712 requirements, I think is becoming interesting. And we are in a very unique, a different socio-political, socio-cultural environment than we have been. For those that were on the call yesterday, part of the realities of 712 are that programs that were implemented in certain fashions and things that we were doing previously, you know, even as 712 was a relatively straightforward, hey, you're just going to do this every 2 years. You're going to continue to do what was on the books and the laws, and I don't emphasize this, but the laws that have been in place for years you're going to do that and you're going to continue to move forward. And then there's just this extra step that you're collecting the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that's being applied during production on the landscape. That served an interesting purpose to, and I'm very blunt here, it served an interesting purpose to go ahead and have us look at the way in which things were done in the past based on those socio-political environments and understand that, we're looking at the language that's in statute, the language that's in reg, and then the language that's in the manuals, and kind of looking at it through a new light. And Bonnie has worked amazingly hard with her staff, and we've got a number of new staff on board, and getting them trained and getting them understanding, how things have changed from 2016 in that legislation, how things have changed in 2020, and the conversations and the outreach that we have to continue to educate, be it the industry groups at the state level, be it the local farm bureaus, be it the individual producers. To that end, I always sing Michael Dukes' praises, and he's on again. I'll continue to do so today. We do have a coordination group that has been set up that Michael and Catherine Holland from my office just do amazing work and keep ourselves, tied together and figure out how to communicate. We have the need through extension, through our work, to make sure that we continue to be lockstep so that information is consistent, so that information is clear, and that we're not giving conflicting, stories of narratives as to how things work. We have a regulatory responsibility. We've got a job to do. That the legislature has tasked us with it. And it has highlighted, tasks that we have been provided or adopted ourselves, in some cases dating back many years, that now tend to be, in a position that we need to be a bit more vehement on. With that comes the need to, to work and undertake education and outreach, which leads to, I think, where Lakesh had us, which is, how can we work together? I listed some of the things that we've already done. One of the things that we wanted to do in the 10 minutes or so that we've got left was really kind of use this as an open forum. We are going through the efforts to develop technical tools for record keeping. We talked about record keeping yesterday. I think that's going to be very, very valuable, and the ability to demonstrate and do either demonstrations or videos or whatnot. The ability to work with our field staff, REMs, our policy, our localized intergovs, which are basically our policy and planning staff, to be able to make sure when extension is going out and doing educational presentations and bringing those localized micro agricultural communities together. I think that's going to be very, very important to make sure that we're on the table, and then continuing to talk about OAWP is that regulatory, we are the state agency, we're coming at it, and we have responsibilities at, be it technical feasibility, economic feasibility, balancing production with water resources protection. We rely on the second scientific and technical underpinnings that we are required to under statute, that IFAS and the great research work that the University of Florida provides us with. However, extension has a bit more flexibility to be able to help us with our programs, but also talk about some of the other great, broader based ideas that are out there, as long as we're being clear and consistent. So with that, I think, Lakesh, what I'll do is kind of stop there. Again, I'm here, Bonnie's here. Bonnie makes me look good because she's much more of an expert than I am and has seen a lot of stuff on the ground. So happy to take questions, happy to get ideas, and just want to have a conversation.
Bonnie, you want to go ahead, or you want Mark to go ahead and share his Word document?
Mark can go ahead, that's fine.
Okay. Mark, would you like to please share your screen and explain the Word document that you have?
I will. Thank you. And by the way, thank you for allowing me to be a part of this panel. I feel like every time I get to participate in these kinds of conversations, I learn something that better equips me to work with our producers. So this has been an enlightening experience for me already. I do have this Word document. I'm not going to go through all of it. It's really just my notes of what I thought were kind of important, the way this thing evolved and came to us. I think like most in extension, within hours of our producers starting to receive the letters back in July, about Senate Bill 712, we started getting phone calls. A lot of those were just kind of shock response. I had kept up a little bit, with the progression of the bill as it was being developed, but not as much detail as I probably should have, as it did most of our producers. They were just kind of hearing a little bit about it, but then all of a sudden it was there. Some of those initial questions, why do they keep pounding ag? Who's going to have access to my proprietary information? These types of questions were those first shock response questions. And I think the only reason I put this in here is because it's real easy as an extension agent to be tempted to jump in the ditch with them and start kicking mud. And in all honesty, that wasn't going to do anything to help our producers get to the point where they could contend with the bill and meet the requirements of it and hopefully move ahead. But so I said in here, I took kind of a cautious presentation of the facts and just tried to help them reason through some of the logic to how it developed, how it became what it was, and what some of the new twists of the programs were. I think one of the big misconceptions early on, and it was some of it was in the FDAC's letter as well as some of the industry messages that were coming out, is that the bill really sounded like it was targeting ag, and automatically that put our folks back on their heels and wanting to be defensive and wanted to know. So the first thing I did was go and pull the Senate bill up and really read it in detail, all 111 pages 2 or 3 times. And that was the only information I could, detailed information I could find that I felt like I could rely on. Tried to relate that back to, how did this come to be? And it kind of started with that 1972 Clean Water Act and just kind of moved forward from there, so that I have a good historical perspective that I then could share with our guys and just help them understand where it was coming from. It didn't necessarily soothe all their sores, but I think it helps them know that they weren't being singled out and that there was some logical progression. It isn't that we just keep turning up the volume and raising the bar, although it seems like that from their perspective. So trying to help them with understanding that. I've got some links in here, and Chris mentioned this yesterday, and I'm just going to open it up real quick. Office of Ag Water Policy has put together this site. This link right here has some really good, I think Dr. Dukes helped and worked with them on this as well, but these frequently asked questions goes through a lot of these types of things that I feel like directing our producers to it, it will help them gain some understanding and hopefully some peace of mind. Trying to get back to my document a little bit. The other big question that kept coming up had to do with who was going to have access to my personal fertilization records and how I apply my stuff. They feel like it's proprietary, and they were concerned that they were going to lose some of their, what they think gives them a competitive edge. And anyhow, obviously the law state, or the law, in the law, it states that these personal records aren't subject to the Personal or the Public Information Act. But one of the things that I'd learned in the November 5th meeting, and then I heard Mr. Pettit mention it again yesterday, is that these numbers, that they're pretty concerned about timing and of their fertilization, how much at different times. The fact that these are going to be aggregated. I had some producers sitting with me in the November 5th meeting, the workshop that was done on a webinar, and that actually seemed to bring some peace of mind to them to know that these, even though they're going to keep their records in detailed format for their own, in their own manual, when they submit these on the NARF, the Nutrient Application Record Form, the fact that they'll be able to aggregate these numbers both by season and by the fields will even be able to be aggregated. So anything under a single NOI could be reported basically as a lump sum. It takes some of that detail that they were concerned about sharing with others that they've spent a lifetime developing, kind of protects that. So that gave them some peace of mind. And I think helping our producers understand this is part of our fundamental, or one of our fundamental roles, is just kind of helping them work through some of that. I'm going to skip on down a little bit. This was a question that started coming up. Why are they going to hassle my landowner? And I think in some of the more recent verbiage that I read, maybe there were some amendments or addendums that were being made to the rule where landowners could be contacted in the event that they felt that the property wasn't being managed under the proper BMP or in the proper manual, or if anyhow, if it just wasn't being listed. And I know that that does happen, and I'm sure that Department of Ag knows it as well. But I think we've still got some questions there. But again, just trying to help our producers know that if they are properly enrolling the crops that they're doing, the landowners probably won't need to be contacted. I felt like this was more of a way to catch up with some that were trying to sneak under the radar a little bit. And they see that, they know that's true. Their major concern with that was some of their leasees or absentee or retired landowners might decide not to lease their land anymore, but instead put it in timber, or even worse, sell it for development, just to avoid the hassle of having to deal with the BMP side of it, especially when it's a leasee that they're having to cover for. But anyhow, that was all these were just kind of these shotgun questions that came up when the rule first came out, the letter first came out from the Department of Ag. Obviously, I think everybody's probably heard this. I wish I could unenroll. And again, it's easy to get in the ditch with them and kick mud and say, yeah, I agree with you. But in all honesty, I think that helping them realize the benefits of being there, from the presumption of compliance to some of the cost share opportunities, and the fact that we are protecting these vital resources, steering them back around and letting them know there's no way to hide from this. This is the world we live in, and it's the charge that we have, is to try to operate, as again Chris put it, in a sustainable manner that balances production with the protection of water resources. But I'm skipping on down pretty quickly. But I said, so a lot of that's just kind of trying to apply a little logic lotion to their chapped hide, and maybe helping them understand some of the science and the history behind it. But I think that there's two other really primary roles that we as extension agents, or us in extension, need to keep in mind. We do have a role. I feel like the field staff with the Office of Ag Water Policy has all the wherewithal to provide that technical support. Fertilizer calculations, field measurements, sampling, IFAS recs, those types of things, alternative strategies. But like Chris was saying just a minute ago, I think that we've got an opportunity to approach it from an educational standpoint as opposed to a regulatory direction, and maybe provide the information and the support that they need at what might be at times a little more palatable way. So I feel like that's definitely one of our first roles as extension agents in helping our producers comply with the requirements, is just getting out there and helping them sort through the technical aspects of it. I love to hear about the resources that are being developed, the electronic resources to help track some of the applications and the records that need to be kept. I think that'll make it even easier, but there's still some feet on the ground kind of things that need to be done to help our producers. The other thing, and this is the one I feel like is probably the most important, and again, listening to these conversations today, the work that's already being done, looking at addressing some of our recommendations and making sure that they're on target, is that as extension faculty, I think we need to be especially attentive to these opportunities and obstacles that this new tighter oversight of Senate Bill 712 may be driving, and work closely with our specialists and our researchers to try to identify opportunities to maybe improve our program a little bit more. So maybe it's putting in some field trials, some demos to help them see the benefit and the uses of some of the new technologies, again, that will both help them maintain compliance and also maintain their production expectations. Boy, I burned through that about as quick as anybody can. I've put in some other links in this little thing, and I think most everybody has access to it. The full Senate bill is available. I encourage you to go through and read it at night when you're ready to go to sleep. It's exciting stuff. The BMP manuals, I think everybody's aware of where they're located, and you can pull those up. I encourage all extension agents to really go through and study them. At one time, I felt like I was pretty familiar with the ones that were most applied to me, vegetable and agronomic primarily. But spending some time really going through the details of those manuals will help you understand a lot better ways that we might be able to help our producers. I noticed that Dr. Rao had already put links to our standardized fertilizer recommendations, SL 129 for agronomic crops and 1152 for vegetable crop production. Great tools, essential resources to go in and actually look and see where our recommendations are. And then in these footnotes, they're very important to go through and look. Some of them, I actually had highlighted one yesterday, but just for example, you know, we hear them talk about sometimes additional supplemental side dress applications can be applied if rainfall amounts are more than 3 inches in 3 days. But those kinds of details that sometimes we hear and we're not sure where they are there in print and available to us. So these are resources that we should have at our fingertips to be able to help our producers. Excuse me. That's kind of what I had, and I know that was kind of a shotgun approach, but this is what we're doing. And again, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Folks, if you have any question to Mark, Chris, or the other group for Plant Nutrition Oversight Committee, please have your question in the chat.
Mark, this is Bonnie. Thank you for that. I think you did a super job of summarizing really a lot of the things that Extension can do for the BMP program. I mean, especially when it comes to taking the mystery out of why they're being hassled. You really have the opportunity to turn down the temperature on a lot of these people and help them realize that they're part of the solution to the overall the work that's being done in the watershed, and letting people know that it's not just about them, that the cities, the counties, the utilities, and everyone has a piece, and this is the ag piece, you know, kind of, it turns things down considerably and lets them listen a little bit better. And you guys can, because you know these people a lot better, you can do an excellent job of assisting with that. So that's a huge piece. And certainly not just helping those producers by working with them on the technologies and so forth, but certainly we see where people want to adopt new technologies, and we have the ability to cost share those new technologies. Helping them to optimize the use of it is something that you guys could help as well. And I know that there's classes that various agents offer around the state to help producers learn to optimize some of these technologies. That would be terrific as well.
Thank you, Bonnie, for your comments. Folks, if you can recall your question now, these presentation will be are recorded and will be on BMP website to go back and review them again. I would like to say thank you to Dr. Dukes for helping me organize this IST, and Dr. Saqib Mukhtar to approve and in a quick manner to have this as soon as possible by end of November, or now we are in December. Thank you all the presenters for your great presentations and great work that you're doing. With that, if there was any question, please reach out to me by email, or Dr. Dukes, Emily will be able to answer as soon as possible. There is no question in the chat box or Q&A, so I would say the meeting is adjourned here. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you, Chris.